The Man in the Brown Suit by Agatha Christie. Narrated by Gertrude Collett and B.J. Harrison. Prologue. Nadina, the Russian dancer who had taken Paris by storm, swayed to the sound of the applause, bowed and bowed again. Her narrow black eyes narrowed themselves still more, and the long line of her scarlet mouth curved faintly upwards. Enthusiastic Frenchmen continued to beat the ground appreciatively as the curtain fell with a swish, hiding the reds and blues and magentas of the bizarre décor. In a swirl of blue and orange draperies, the dancer left the stage. A bearded gentleman received her enthusiastically in his arms. It was the manager.
"Magnificent, petite, magnificent!" he cried. "Tonight you have surpassed yourself."
He kissed her gallantly on both cheeks, in a somewhat matter-of-fact manner. Madame Nadina accepted the tribute with the ease of long habit and passed on to her dressing-room, where bouquets were heaped carelessly everywhere. Marvellous garments of futuristic design hung on pegs, and the air was hot and sweet, with the scent of the massed blossoms, and with more sophisticated perfumes and essences. Jeanne, the dresser, ministered to her mistress, talking incessantly and pouring out a stream of fulsome compliment. A knock at the door interrupted the flow. Jeanne went to answer it and returned with a card in her hand. "Madame will receive?" "Let me see." The dancer stretched out a languid hand, but at the sight of the name on the card, Count Sergius Polovitch, a sudden flicker of interest came into her eyes. "I will see him. The maize peignoir, Jeanne, and quickly, and when the Count comes, you may go." "Bien, madame." Jeanne brought the peignoir, an exquisite wisp of corn-coloured chiffon and ermine. Nadina slipped into it and sat smiling to herself, whilst one long white hand beat a slow tattoo on the glass of the dressing-table. The Count was prompt to avail himself of the privilege accorded to him. A man of medium height, very slim, very elegant, very pale, extraordinarily weary. In feature, little to take hold of. A man difficult to recognize again if one left his mannerisms out of account. He bowed over the dancer's hand with exaggerated courtliness. "Madame, this is a pleasure indeed." So much Jeanne heard before she went out, closing the door behind her. Alone with her visitor, a subtle change came over Nadina's smile. "Compatriots though we are, we will not speak Russian, I think," she observed. "Since we neither of us know a word of the language, it might be as well," agreed her guest. By common consent, they dropped into English, and nobody, now that the Count's mannerisms had dropped from him, could doubt that it was his native language. He had, indeed, started life as a quick-change music-hall artiste in London. "You had a great success tonight," he remarked. "I congratulate you." "All the same," said the woman, "I am disturbed. My position is not what it was. The suspicions aroused during the war have never died down. I am continually watched and spied upon." "But no charge of espionage was ever brought against you?" "Our chief lays his plans too carefully for that." "Long life to the Colonel," said the Count, smiling. "Amazing news. Is it not that he means to retire? To retire! Just like a doctor, or a butcher, or a plumber." "Or any other businessman," finished Nadina. "It should not surprise us. That is what the Colonel has always been, an excellent man of business. He has organized crime as another man might organize a boot factory. Without committing himself, he has planned and directed a series of stupendous coups, embracing every branch of what we might call his profession, jewel robberies, forgery, espionage, the latter very profitable in wartime, sabotage, discreet assassination. There is hardly anything he has not touched. Wisest of all, he knows when to stop. The game begins to be dangerous, and he retires gracefully, with an enormous fortune.
Said the Count doubtfully. It is rather upsetting for all of us. We are at loose ends, as it were.
But we are being paid off on a most generous scale. Some undercurrent of mockery in her tone made the man look at her sharply. She was smiling to herself, and the quality of her smile aroused his curiosity. But he proceeded diplomatically.
Yes, the Colonel has always been a generous paymaster. I attribute much of his success to that, and to his invariable plan of providing a suitable scapegoat. A great brain, undoubtedly, a great brain, and an apostle of the maxim, if you want a thing done safely, do not do it yourself. Here we are, every one of us incriminated up to the hilt and absolutely in his power, and not one of us has anything on him.
He paused, almost as though he were expecting her to disagree with him, but she remained silent, smiling to herself as before.
Not one of us,
he mused.
Still, you know, he is superstitious, the old man. Years ago, I believe, he went to one of those fortune-telling people. She prophesied a lifetime of success, but declared that his downfall would be brought about through a woman.
He had interested her now. She looked up eagerly. That is strange, very strange. Through a woman, you say? He smiled and shrugged his shoulders.
Doubtless, now that he has retired, he will marry some young society beauty who will disburse his millions faster than he acquired them.
Nadina shook her head. No, that is not the way of it. Listen, my friend. Tomorrow I go to London.
But your contract here?
I shall be away only one night, and I go incognito, like royalty. No one will ever know I have left France. And why do you think that I go?
Hardly for pleasure at this time of year. January, a detestable foggy month. It must be for profit, eh?
Exactly. She rose and stood in front of him, every graceful line of her arrogant with pride. You said just now that none of us had anything on the chief. You were wrong. I have. I, a woman, have had the wit and, yes, the courage, for it needs courage, to double-cross him. You remember the De Beer diamonds?
Yes, I remember. At Kimberley, just before the war broke out. I had nothing to do with it, and I never heard the details. The case was hushed up for some reason, was it not? A fine haul, too.
£100,000 worth of stones. 2 of us worked it, under the Colonel's orders, of course. And it was then that I saw my chance. You see, the plan was to substitute some of the De Beer diamonds for some sample diamonds brought from South America by 2 young prospectors who happened to be in Kimberley at the time. Suspicion was then bound to fall on them.
Very clever,
interpolated the Count approvingly. The Colonel was always clever. Well, I did my part, but I also did one thing which the Colonel had not foreseen. I kept back some of the South American stones. 1 or 2 are unique and could easily be proved never to have passed through De Beer's hands. With these diamonds in my possession, I have the whip hand of my esteemed chief. Once the 2 young men are cleared, his part in the matter is bound to be suspected. I have said nothing all these years. I have been content to know that I had this weapon in reserve. But now matters are different. I want my price, and it will be a big, I might almost say a staggering price."
"Extraordinary," said the Count. "And doubtless you carry these diamonds about with you everywhere?"
His eyes roamed gently round the disordered room. Nadina laughed softly. "You need suppose nothing of the sort. I am not a fool. The diamonds are in a safe place where no one will dream of looking for them."
"I never thought you a fool, my dear lady, but may I venture to suggest that you are somewhat foolhardy? The Colonel is not the type of man to take kindly to being blackmailed, you know."
"I am not afraid of him," she laughed. "There is only one man I have ever feared, and he is dead." The man looked at her curiously.
"Let us hope that he will not come to life again, then," he remarked lightly.
"What do you mean?"
cried the dancer sharply. The Count looked slightly surprised. "I only meant that a resurrection would be awkward for you," he explained. "A foolish joke."
She gave a sigh of relief. "Oh, no, he is dead all right, killed in the war. He was a man who once loved me."
"In South Africa?" asked the Count negligently.
"Yes, since you ask it, in South Africa."
"That is your native country, is it not?"
She nodded. Her visitor rose and reached for his hat.
"Well," he remarked, "you know your own business best, but if I were you, I should fear the Colonel far more than any disillusioned lover. He is a man whom it is particularly easy to underestimate."
She laughed scornfully. "As if I did not know him after all these years."
"I wonder if you do," he said softly. "I very much wonder if you do."
"Oh, I am not a fool. And I am not alone in this. The South African mailboat docks at Southampton tomorrow, and on board her is a man who has come specially from Africa at my request, and who has carried out certain orders of mine. The Colonel will not have one of us to deal with, but two."
"Is that wise?"
"It is necessary."
"You're sure of this man?"
A rather peculiar smile played over the dancer's face. "I am quite sure of him. He is inefficient, but perfectly trustworthy." She paused, and then added in an indifferent tone of voice, "As a matter of fact, he happens to be my husband." Prologue. Nadina, the Russian dancer who had taken Paris by storm, swayed to the sound of the applause, bowed and bowed again. Her narrow black eyes narrowed themselves still more, and the long line of her scarlet mouth curved faintly upwards. Enthusiastic Frenchmen continued to beat the ground appreciatively as the curtain fell with a swish, hiding the reds and blues and magentas of the bizarre décor. In a swirl of blue and orange draperies, the dancer left the stage. A bearded gentleman received her enthusiastically in his arms. It was the manager.
"Magnificent, petite, magnificent!" he cried. "Tonight you have surpassed yourself."
He kissed her gallantly on both cheeks, in a somewhat matter-of-fact manner. Madame Nadina accepted the tribute with the ease of long habit and passed on to her dressing-room, where bouquets were heaped carelessly everywhere. Marvellous garments of futuristic design hung on pegs, and the air was hot and sweet, with the scent of the massed blossoms, and with more sophisticated perfumes and essences. Jeanne, the dresser, ministered to her mistress, talking incessantly and pouring out a stream of fulsome compliment. A knock at the door interrupted the flow. Jeanne went to answer it and returned with a card in her hand. "Madame will receive?" "Let me see." The dancer stretched out a languid hand, but at the sight of the name on the card, Count Sergius Polovitch, a sudden flicker of interest came into her eyes.
I will see him. The maize peignoir, Jeanne, and quickly, and when the Count comes, you may go."
"Bien, madame."
Jeanne brought the peignoir, an exquisite wisp of corn-coloured chiffon and ermine. Nadina slipped into it and sat smiling to herself, whilst one long white hand beat a slow tattoo on the glass of the dressing-table. The Count was prompt to avail himself of the privilege accorded to him. A man of medium height, very slim, very elegant, very pale, extraordinarily weary. In feature, little to take hold of. A man difficult to recognize again if one left his mannerisms out of account. He bowed over the dancer's hand with exaggerated courtliness. "Madame, this is a pleasure indeed." So much Jeanne heard before she went out, closing the door behind her. Alone with her visitor, a subtle change came over Nadina's smile. "Compatriots though we are, we will not speak Russian, I think," she observed. "Since we neither of us know a word of the language, it might be as well," agreed her guest. By common consent, they dropped into English, and nobody, now that the Count's mannerisms had dropped from him, could doubt that it was his native language. He had, indeed, started life as a quick-change music-hall artiste in London. "You had a great success tonight," he remarked. "I congratulate you." "All the same," said the woman, "I am disturbed. My position is not what it was. The suspicions aroused during the war have never died down. I am continually watched and spied upon." "But no charge of espionage was ever brought against you?" "Our chief lays his plans too carefully for that." "Long life to the Colonel," said the Count, smiling. "Amazing news. Is it not that he means to retire? To retire! Just like a doctor, or a butcher, or a plumber."
"Or any other businessman," finished Nadina. "It should not surprise us. That is what the Colonel has always been, an excellent man of business. He has organized crime as another man might organize a boot factory. Without committing himself, he has planned and directed a series of stupendous coups, embracing every branch of what we might call his profession: jewel robberies, forgery, espionage, the latter very profitable in wartime, sabotage, discreet assassination. There is hardly anything he has not touched. Wisest of all, he knows when to stop. The game begins to be dangerous, and he retires gracefully, with an enormous fortune."
Said the Count doubtfully. "It is rather upsetting for all of us. We are at loose ends, as it were."
"But we are being paid off on a most generous scale." Some undercurrent of mockery in her tone made the man look at her sharply. She was smiling to herself, and the quality of her smile aroused his curiosity. But he proceeded diplomatically.
"Yes, the Colonel has always been a generous paymaster. I attribute much of his success to that, and to his invariable plan of providing a suitable scapegoat. A great brain, undoubtedly, a great brain, and an apostle of the maxim, if you want a thing done safely, do not do it yourself. Here we are, every one of us incriminated up to the hilt and absolutely in his power, and not one of us has anything on him."
He paused, almost as though he were expecting her to disagree with him, but she remained silent, smiling to herself as before.
"Not one of us," he mused. "Still, you know, he is superstitious, the old man. Years ago, I believe, he went to one of those fortune-telling people. She prophesied a lifetime of success, but declared that his downfall would be brought about through a woman."
He had interested her now. She looked up eagerly. "That is strange, very strange. Through a woman, you say?" He smiled and shrugged his shoulders.
Doubtless, now that he has retired, he will marry some young society beauty who will disperse his millions faster than he acquired them.
Nadina shook her head. No, that is not the way of it. Listen, my friend. Tomorrow I go to London.
But your contract here?
I shall be away only one night, and I go incognito, like royalty. No one will ever know I have left France. And why do you think that I go?
Hardly for pleasure at this time of year. January, a detestable foggy month. It must be for profit, eh?
Exactly. She rose and stood in front of him, every graceful line of her arrogant with pride. You said just now that none of us had anything on the chief. You were wrong. I have. I, a woman, have had the wit and, yes, the courage, for it needs courage, to double-cross him. You remember the De Beer diamonds?
Yes, I remember. At Kimberley, just before the war broke out. I had nothing to do with it, and I never heard the details. The case was hushed up for some reason, was it not? A fine haul, too.
£100,000 worth of stones. 2 of us worked it, under the Colonel's orders, of course. And it was then that I saw my chance. You see, the plan was to substitute some of the De Beer diamonds for some sample diamonds brought from South America by 2 young prospectors who happened to be in Kimberley at the time. Suspicion was then bound to fall on them.
Very clever,
interpolated the Count approvingly. The Colonel was always clever. Well, I did my part, but I also did one thing which the Colonel had not foreseen. I kept back some of the South American stones. 1 or 2 are unique and could easily be proved never to have passed through De Beer's hands. With these diamonds in my possession, I have the whip hand of my esteemed chief. Once the 2 young men are cleared, his part in the matter is bound to be suspected. I have said nothing all these years. I have been content to know that I had this weapon in reserve. But now matters are different. I want my price, and it will be a big, I might almost say a staggering price.
Extraordinary, said the Count. And doubtless you carry these diamonds about with you everywhere.
His eyes roamed gently round the disordered room. Nadina laughed softly. You need suppose nothing of the sort. I am not a fool. The diamonds are in a safe place where no one will dream of looking for them.
I never thought you a fool, my dear lady, but may I venture to suggest that you are somewhat foolhardy? The Colonel is not the type of man to take kindly to being blackmailed, you know.
I am not afraid of him, she laughed. There is only one man I have ever feared, and he is dead. The man looked at her curiously.
Let us hope that he will not come to life again, then, he remarked lightly.
What do you mean? Cried the dancer sharply. The Count looked slightly surprised.
I only meant that a resurrection would be awkward for you, he explained. A foolish joke.
She gave a sigh of relief. Oh, no, he is dead all right, killed in the war. He was a man who once loved me.
In South Africa? Asked the Count negligently.
Yes, since you ask it. In South Africa.
That is your native country, is it not?
She nodded. Her visitor rose and reached for his hat.
Well, he remarked, you know your own business best, but if I were you, I should fear the Colonel far more than any disillusioned lover. He is a man whom it is particularly easy to underestimate.
She laughed scornfully. As if I did not know him after all these years.
I wonder if you do, he said softly. I very much wonder if you do.
Oh, I am not a fool. And I am not alone in this. The South African mailboat docks at Southampton tomorrow, and on board her is a man who has come specially from Africa at my request, and who has carried out certain orders of mine. The Colonel will not have one of us to deal with, but two.
Is that wise?
It is necessary.
You're sure of this man?
A rather peculiar smile played over the dancer's face. I'm quite sure of him. He is inefficient, but perfectly trustworthy. She paused, and then added in an indifferent tone of voice, As a matter of fact, he happens to be my husband. Chapter 1. Everybody has been at me, right and left, to write this story from the great, represented by Lord Nasby, to the small, represented by our late maid of all work, Emily, whom I saw when I was last in England. Lor, miss, what a beautiful book you might make out of it all, just like the pictures. I'll admit that I've certain qualifications for the task. I was mixed up in the affair from the very beginning. I was in the thick of it all through, and I was triumphantly in at the death. Very fortunately, too, the gaps that I cannot supply from my own knowledge are amply covered by Sir Eustace Pedler's diary, of which he has kindly begged me to make use. So here goes. Anne Bedingfeld starts to narrate her adventures. I'd always longed for adventures. You see, my life had such a dreadful sameness. My father, Professor Bedingfeld, was one of England's greatest living authorities on primitive man. He really was a genius. Everyone admits that. His mind dwelt in Paleolithic times, and the inconvenience of life for him was that his body inhabited the modern world. Papa did not care for modern man. Even the Neolithic man he despised as a mere herder of cattle, and he did not rise to enthusiasm until he reached the Mousterian period. Unfortunately, one cannot entirely dispense with modern men. One is forced to have some kind of truck with butchers and bakers and milkmen and greengrocers. Therefore, Papa being immersed in the past, Mamma having died when I was a baby, it fell to me to undertake the practical side of living. Frankly, I hate Paleolithic man, be he Aurignacian, Mousterian, Chelian, or anything else. And though I typed and revised most of Papa's Neanderthal man and his ancestors, Neanderthal men themselves fill me with loathing, and I always reflect what a fortunate circumstance it was that they became extinct in remote ages. I do not know whether Papa guessed my feelings on the subject. Probably not. And in any case, he would not have been interested. The opinion of other people never interested him in the slightest degree. I think it was really a sign of his greatness. In the same way, he lived quite detached from the necessities of daily life. He ate what was put before him in an exemplary fashion, but seemed mildly pained when the question of paying for it arose. We never seemed to have any money. His celebrity was not of the kind that brought in a cash return. Although he was a fellow of almost every important society, and had rows of letters after his name, the general public scarcely knew of his existence, and his long, learned books, though adding signally to the sum total of human knowledge, had no attraction for the masses. Only on one occasion did he leap into the public gaze. He had read a paper before some society on the subject of the young of the chimpanzee. The young of the human race show some anthropoid features, whereas the young of the chimpanzee approach more nearly to the human than the adult chimpanzee does. That seems to show that whereas our ancestors were more simian than we are, the chimpanzees were of a higher type than the present species. In other words, the chimpanzee is a degenerate. That enterprising newspaper, the Daily Budget, being hard up for something spicy, immediately brought itself out with large headlines. "We are not descended from monkeys, but our monkeys descended from us. Eminent professor says chimpanzees are decadent humans." Shortly afterwards, a reporter called to see Papa and endeavoured to induce him to write a series of popular articles on the theory. I have seldom seen Papa so angry. He turned the reporter out of the house with scant ceremony, much to my secret sorrow, as we were particularly short of money at the moment. In fact, for a moment I meditated running after the young man and informing him that my father had changed his mind and would send the articles in question. I could easily have written them myself, and the probabilities were that Papa would never have learnt of the transaction, not being a reader of the Daily Budget. However, I rejected this course as being too risky, so I merely put on my best hat and went sadly down the village to interview our justly irate grocer. The reporter from the Daily Budget was the only young man who ever came to our house. There were times when I envied Emily, our little servant, who walked out whenever occasion offered with a large sailor to whom she was affianced. In between times, to keep her hand in, as she expressed it, she walked out with the greengrocer's young man and the chemist's assistant. I reflected sadly that I had no one to keep my hand in with. All Papa's friends were aged professors, usually with long beards. It is true that Professor Peterson once clasped me affectionately and said I had a neat little waist, then tried to kiss me. The phrase alone dated him hopelessly. No self-respecting female has a neat little waist since I was in my cradle. I yearned for adventure, for love, for romance, and I seemed condemned to an existence of drab utility. The village possessed a lending library full of tattered works of fiction, and I enjoyed perils and love-making at second hand, and went to sleep dreaming of stern, silent Rhodesians, and of strong men who always felled their opponent with a single blow. There was no one in the village who even looked as though he could fell an opponent with a single blow or with several. There was the kinema, too, with a weekly episode of The Perils of Pamela. Pamela was a magnificent young woman. Nothing daunted her. She fell out of aeroplanes, adventured in submarines, climbed skyscrapers, and crept about in the underworld without turning a hair. She was not really clever. The master criminal of the underworld caught her each time, but as he seemed loath to knock her on the head in a simple way, and always doomed her to death in a sewer gas chamber or by some new and marvellous means, the hero was always able to rescue her at the beginning of the following week's episode. I used to come out with my head in a delirious whirl, and then I would get home and find a notice from the gas company threatening to cut us off if the outstanding account was not paid. And yet, though I did not suspect it, every moment was bringing adventure nearer to me. It is possible that there are many people in the world who have never heard of the finding of an antique skull at the Broken Hill mine in northern Rhodesia. I came down one morning to find Papa excited to the point of apoplexy. He poured out the whole story to me.
"You understand, Anne, there are undoubtedly certain resemblances to the Java skull, but superficial only. No, here we have what I have always maintained, the ancestral form of the Neanderthal race. You grant that the Gibraltar skull is the most primitive of the Neanderthal skulls found? Why? The cradle of the race was in Africa. They passed to Europe."
"Not marmalade on kippers, Papa," I said hastily, arresting my parents' absent-minded hand. "Yes, you were saying?"
"They passed to Europe on—"
Here he broke down with a bad fit of choking, the result of an immoderate mouthful of kipper bones.
"But we must start at once,"
he declared, as he rose to his feet at the conclusion of the meal.
"There is no time to be lost. We must be on the spot. There are doubtless incalculable finds to be found in the neighbourhood. I shall be interested to note whether the implements are typical of the Mousterian period. There will be the remains of the primitive ox, I should say, but not those of the woolly rhinoceros. Yes, our little army will be starting soon. We must get ahead of them. You will write to Cook's today, Anne?
What about money, Papa? I hinted delicately. He turned a reproachful eye upon me.
Your point of view always depresses me, my child. We must not be sordid. No, no, in the cause of science, one must not be sordid.
I feel Cook's might be sordid, Papa. Papa looked pained.
My dear Anne, you will pay them in ready money.
I haven't got any ready money.
Papa looked thoroughly exasperated. My child, I really cannot be bothered with these vulgar money details. The bank... I had something from the manager yesterday saying I had £27.
That's your overdraft, I fancy.
Ah, I have it. Write to my publishers.
I acquiesced doubtfully. Papa's books bringing in more glory than money. I liked the idea of going to Rhodesia immensely. Stern, silent men, I murmured to myself in an ecstasy. Then something in my parents' appearance struck me as unusual. You have odd boots on, Papa, I said. Take off the brown one and put on the other black one. And don't forget your muffler. It's a very cold day. In a few minutes, Papa stalked off, correctly booted and well muffled. He returned late that evening, and, to my dismay, I saw that his muffler and overcoat were missing.
Dear me, Anne, you are quite right. I took them off to go into the cavern. One gets so dirty there.
I nodded feelingly, remembering an occasion when Papa had returned literally plastered from head to foot with rich Pliocene clay. Our principal reason for settling in Little Hamsley had been the neighbourhood of Hamsley Cavern, a buried cave rich in deposits of the Aurignacian culture. We had a tiny museum in the village, and the curator and Papa spent most of their days messing about underground and bringing to light portions of woolly rhinoceros and cave bear. Papa coughed badly all the evening, and the following morning I saw he had a temperature and sent for the doctor. Poor Papa. He never had a chance. It was double pneumonia. He died 4 days later. Chapter 2. Everyone was very kind to me. Dazed as I was, I appreciated that. I felt no overwhelming grief. Papa had never loved me. I knew that well enough. If he had, I might have loved him in return. No, there had not been love between us, but we had belonged together, and I had looked after him, and had secretly admired his learning and his uncompromising devotion to science. And it hurt me that Papa should have died just when the interest of life was right at its height for him. I should have felt happier if I could have buried him in a cave, with paintings of reindeer and flint implements. But the force of public opinion constrained a neat tomb, with marble slab, in our hideous local churchyard. The vicar's consolations, though well meant, did not console me in the least. It took some time to dawn upon me that the thing I had always longed for, freedom, was at last mine. I was an orphan, and practically penniless, but free. At the same time, realized the extraordinary kindness of all these good people. The vicar did his best to persuade me that his wife was in urgent need of a companion help. Our tiny local library suddenly made up its mind to have an assistant librarian. Finally, the doctor called upon me, and after making various ridiculous excuses for failing to send in a proper bill, he hummed and hawed a good deal, and suddenly suggested I should marry him. I was very much astonished. The doctor was nearer 40 than 30, and a round, tubby little man. He was not at all like the hero of the Perils of Pamela, and even less like a stern and silent Rhodesian. I reflected a minute and then asked him why he wanted to marry me. That seemed to fluster him a good deal, and he murmured that a wife was a great help to a general practitioner. The position seemed even more unromantic than before, and yet something in me urged toward its acceptance. Safety. That was what I was being offered. Safety. And a comfortable home. Thinking it over now, I believe I did the little man an injustice. He was honestly in love with me, but a mistaken delicacy prevented him from pressing his suit on those lines. Anyway, my love of romance rebelled. "It's extremely kind of you," I said, "but it's impossible. I could never marry a man unless I loved him madly."
You don't think...
"No, I don't," I said firmly. He sighed.
But, my dear child, what do you propose to do?"
"Have adventures and see the world," I replied without the least hesitation.
"Miss Anne, you are very much of a child still. You don't understand—"
"The practical difficulties? Yes, I do, Doctor. I'm not a sentimental schoolgirl. I'm a hard-headed mercenary shrew. You'd know it if you married me."
"I wish you would reconsider—"
"I can't." He sighed again.
"I have another proposal to make. An aunt of mine who lives in Wales is in want of a young lady to help her. How would that suit you?"
"No, Doctor. I'm going to London. If things happen anywhere, they happen in London. I shall keep my eyes open, and you'll see, something will turn up. You'll hear of me next in China or Timbuktu." My next visitor was Mr. Fleming, Papa's London solicitor. He came down specially from town to see me. An ardent anthropologist himself, he was a great admirer of Papa's works. He was a tall, spare man with a thin face and grey hair. He rose to meet me as I entered the room, and, taking both my hands in his, patted them affectionately.
"My poor child,"
he said.
"My poor, poor child."
Without conscious hypocrisy, I found myself assuming the demeanour of a bereaved orphan. He hypnotized me into it. He was benignant, kind, and fatherly, and without the least doubt he regarded me as a perfect fool of a girl let adrift to face an unkind world. From the first I felt that it was quite useless to try to convince him of the contrary. As things turned out, perhaps it was just as well I didn't.
"My dear child, do you think you can listen to me whilst I try to make a few things clear to you?"
"Oh, yes."
"Your father, as you know, was a very great man. Posterity will appreciate him. But he was not a good man of business."
I knew that quite as well, if not better, than Mr. Fleming, but I restrained myself from saying so. He continued.
"I do not suppose you understand much of these matters. I will try to explain as clearly as I can."
He explained in unnecessary length. The upshot seemed to be that I was left to face life with the sum of £87, 17 shillings, 4 pence. It seemed a strangely unsatisfying amount. I waited in some trepidation for what was coming next. I feared that Mr. Fleming would be sure to have an aunt in Scotland who was in want of a bright young companion. Apparently, however, he hadn't.
"The question is," he went on, "the future. I understand you have no living relatives?"
"I am alone in the world," I said, and was struck anew by my likeness to a film heroine.
"You have friends?"
"Everyone has been very kind to me," I said gratefully.
"Who would not be kind to one so young and charming?" said Mr. Fleming gallantly. "Well, well, my dear, we must see what can be done."
He hesitated a minute, and then said,
"Supposing, how would it be if you came to us for a time?"
I jumped at the chance. London, the place for things to happen. It's awfully kind of you, I said. Might I really? Just while I'm looking round. I must start out to earn my living, you know.
Yes, yes, my dear child, I quite understand. We will look round for something suitable.
I felt instinctively that Mr. Fleming's ideas of something suitable and mine were likely to be widely divergent, but that was certainly not the moment to air my views.
That is settled, then. Why not return with me today?
Oh, thank you. But will Mrs. Fleming—
My wife will be delighted to welcome you.
I wonder if husbands know as much about their wives as they think they do. If I had a husband, I should hate him to bring home orphans without consulting me first.
We will send her a wire from the station,
continued the lawyer. My few personal belongings were soon packed. I contemplated my hat sadly before putting it on. It had originally been what I call a merry hat, meaning by that the kind of hat a housemaid ought to wear on her day out, but doesn't. A limp thing of black straw with a suitably depressed brim. With the inspiration of genius, I had kicked it once, punched it twice, dented in the crown, and affixed to it a thing like a cubist's dream of a jazz carrot. The result had been distinctly chic. The carrot I had already removed, of course, and now I proceeded to undo the rest of my handiwork. The merry hat resumed its former status with an additional battered appearance which made it even more depressing than formerly. I might as well look as much like the popular conception of an orphan as possible. I was just a shade nervous of Mrs. Fleming's reception, but hoped my appearance might have a sufficiently disarming effect. Mr. Fleming was nervous too. I realized that as we went up the stairs of the tall house in a quiet Kensington Square. Mrs. Fleming greeted me pleasantly enough. She was a stout, placid woman of the good wife and mother type. She took me up to a spotless, chintz-hung bedroom, hoped I had everything I wanted, informed me that tea would be ready in about a quarter of an hour, and left me to my own devices. I heard her voice slightly raised as she entered the drawing-room below on the first floor. "Well, Henry, why on earth—" I lost the rest, but the acerbity of the tone was evident, and a few minutes later another phrase floated up to me, in an even more acid voice. "I agree with you. She is certainly very good-looking." It is really a very hard life. Men will not be nice to you if you are not good-looking, and women will not be nice to you if you are. With a deep sigh, I proceeded to do things to my hair. I have nice hair. It is black, a real black, not dark brown, and it grows well back from my forehead and down over the ears. With a ruthless hand, I dragged it upwards. As ears, my ears are quite all right, but there is no doubt about it. Ears are de monde nowadays. They are like the Queen of Spain's legs in Professor Peterson's young day. When I had finished, I looked almost unbelievably like the kind of orphan that walks out in a queue with a little bonnet and a red cloak. I noticed when I went down that Mrs. Fleming's eyes rested upon my exposed ears with quite a kindly glance. Mr. Fleming seemed puzzled. I had no doubt that he was saying to himself, "What has that child done to herself?" On the whole, the rest of the day passed off well. It was settled that I was to start at once to look for something to do. When I went to bed, I stared earnestly at my face in the glass. Was I really good-looking? Honestly, I couldn't say I thought so. I hadn't got a straight Grecian nose, or a rosebud mouth, or any of the things you ought to have. It is true that a curate once told me that my eyes were like imprisoned sunshine in a dark, dark wood. But curates always know so many quotations and fire them off at random. I much prefer to have Irish blue eyes than dark green ones with yellow flecks. Still, green is a good colour for adventuresses. I wound a black garment tightly round me, leaving my arms and shoulders bare. Then I brushed back my hair and pulled it well down over my ears again. I put a lot of powder on my face, so that the skin seemed even whiter than usual. I fished about until I found some old lip salve, and I put oceans of it on my lips. Then I did under my eyes with burnt cork. Finally, I draped a red ribbon over my bare shoulder, stuck a scarlet feather in my hair, and placed a cigarette in one corner of my mouth. The whole effect pleased me very much. "Anna the Adventuress," I said aloud, nodding at my reflection. "Anna the Adventuress, Episode 1, The House in Kensington." Girls are foolish things. Chapter 3. In the succeeding weeks, I was a good deal bored. Mrs. Fleming and her friends seemed to me to be supremely uninteresting. They talked for hours of themselves and their children, and of the difficulties of getting good milk for the children, and of what they said to the dairy when the milk wasn't good. Then they would go on to servants, and the difficulties of getting good servants, and of what they had said to the woman at the registry office, and of what the woman at the registry office had said to them. They never seemed to read the papers or to care about what went on in the world. They disliked travelling. Everything was so different to England. The Riviera was all right, of course, because one met all one's friends there. I listened and contained myself with difficulty. Most of these women were rich. The whole wide, beautiful world was theirs to wander in, and they deliberately stayed in dirty, dull London and talked about milkmen and servants. I think now, looking back, that I was perhaps a shade intolerant. But they were stupid even at their chosen job. Most of them kept the most extraordinarily inadequate and muddled housekeeping accounts. My affairs did not progress very fast. The house and furniture had been sold, and the amount realized had just covered our debts. As yet, I had not been successful in finding a post. Not that I really wanted one. I had the firm conviction that if I went about looking for adventure, adventure would meet me halfway. It is a theory of mine that one always gets what one wants. My theory was about to be proved in practice. It was early in January, the 8th to be exact. I was returning from an unsuccessful interview with a lady who said she wanted a secretary companion, but really seemed to require a strong charwoman who would work 12 hours a day for £25 a year. Having parted with mutual veiled impoliteness, I walked down Edgware Road. The interview had taken place in a house in St. John's Wood, and across Hyde Park to St. George's Hospital. There I entered Hyde Park Corner tube station and took a ticket to Gloucester Road. Once on the platform, I walked to the extreme end of it. My inquiring mind wished to satisfy itself as to whether there really were points and an opening between the two tunnels just beyond the station in the direction of Down Street. I was foolishly pleased to find I was right. There were not many people on the platform, and at the extreme end there was only myself and one man. As I passed him, I sniffed dubiously. If there was one smell I cannot bear, it is that of mothballs. This man's heavy overcoat simply reeked of them, and yet most men begin to wear their winter overcoats before January, and consequently by this time the smell ought to have worn off. The man was beyond me, standing close to the edge of the tunnel. He seemed lost in thought, and I was able to stare at him without rudeness. He was a small, thin man, very brown of face, with light blue eyes, and a small, dark beard. Just come from abroad, I deduced. That's why his overcoat smells so. He's come from India, not an officer, or he wouldn't have a beard. Perhaps a tea planter. At this moment the man turned as though to retrace his steps along the platform. He glanced at me, and then his eyes went on to something behind me, and his face changed. It was distorted by fear, almost panic. He took a step backwards, as though involuntarily recoiling from some danger, forgetting that he was standing on the extreme edge of the platform, and went down and over. There was a vivid flash from the rails and a crackling sound. I shrieked. People came running up. 2 station officials seemed to materialize from nowhere and took command. I remained where I was, rooted to the spot by a sort of horrible fascination. Part of me was appalled at the sudden disaster, and another part of me was coolly and dispassionately interested in the methods employed for lifting the man off the live rail and back onto the platform.
"Let me pass, please. I am a medical man."
A tall man with a brown beard pressed past me and bent over the motionless body. As he examined it, a curious sense of unreality seemed to possess me. The thing wasn't real, couldn't be. Finally, the doctor stood upright and shook his head.
"Dead as a doornail. Nothing to be done."
We had all crowded nearer, and an aggrieved porter raised his voice.
"Now then, stand back there, will you? What's the sense of crowding round?"
A sudden nausea seized me, and I turned blindly and ran up the stairs again toward the lift. I felt that it was too horrible. I must get out into the open air. The doctor who had examined the body was just ahead of me. The lift was just about to go up, another having descended, and he broke into a run. As he did so, he dropped a piece of paper. I stopped, picked it up, and ran after him, but the lift gates clanged in my face, and I was left holding the paper in my hand. By the time the second lift reached the street level, there was no sign of my quarry. I hoped it was nothing important that he had lost, and for the first time I examined it. It was a plain half-sheet of notepaper with some figures and words scrawled upon it in pencil. 17.122 Kilmorden Castle. On the face of it, it certainly did not appear to be of any importance. Still, I hesitated to throw it away. As I stood there holding it, I involuntarily wrinkled my nose in displeasure. Mothballs again! I held the paper gingerly to my nose. Yes, it smelt strongly of them, but then I folded up the paper carefully and put it in my bag. I walked home slowly and did a good deal of thinking. I explained to Mrs. Fleming that I had witnessed a nasty accident in the tube and that I was rather upset and would go up to my room and lie down. The kind woman insisted on my having a cup of tea. After that, I was left to my own devices, and I proceeded to carry out a plan I had formed coming home. I wanted to know what it was that had produced that curious feeling of unreality whilst I was watching the doctor examine the body. First, I lay down on the floor in the attitude of the corpse. Then I laid a bolster down in my stead and proceeded to duplicate, so far as I could remember, every motion and gesture of the doctor. When I had finished, I had got what I wanted. I sat back on my heels and frowned at the opposite walls. There was a brief notice in the evening papers that a man had been killed in the tube, and a doubt was expressed whether it was suicide or accident. That seemed to make my duty clear, and when Mr. Fleming heard my story, he quite agreed with me.
"Undoubtedly, you will be wanted at the inquest. You say no one else was near enough to see what happened?"
I had the feeling someone was coming up behind me, but I can't be sure. And anyway, they wouldn't be as near as I was. The inquest was held. Mr. Fleming made all the arrangements and took me there with him. He seemed to fear that it would be a great ordeal to me, and I had to conceal from him my complete composure. The deceased had been identified as L.B. Cotton, Nothing had been found in his pockets except a house agent's order to view a house on the river near Marlow. It was in the name of L.B. Carton, Russell Hotel. The bureau clerk from the hotel identified the man as having arrived the day before and booked a room under that name. He had registered as L.B. Carton, Kimberley, South Africa. He had evidently come straight off the steamer. I was the only person who had seen anything of the affair.
"You think it was an accident?"
the coroner asked me. "I am positive of it. Something alarmed him, and he stepped backwards blindly without thinking what he was doing."
"But what could have alarmed him?"
"That I don't know, but there was something. He looked panic-stricken." A stolid juryman suggested that some men were terrified of cats. The man might have seen a cat. I didn't think the suggestion a very brilliant one, but it seemed to pass muster with the jury, who were obviously impatient to get home and only too pleased at being able to give a verdict of accident as opposed to suicide.
"It is extraordinary to me," said the coroner, "that the doctor who first examined the body has not come forward. His name and address should have been taken at the time. It was most irregular not to do so."
I smiled to myself. I had my own theory in regard to the doctor. In pursuance of it, I determined to make a call upon Scotland Yard at an early date. But the next morning brought a surprise. The Flemings took in the Daily Budget, and the Daily Budget was having a day after its own heart. "Extraordinary sequel to tube accident. Woman found stabbed in lonely house." I read eagerly. "A sensational discovery was made yesterday at the Mill House, Marlow. The Mill House, which is the property of Sir Eustace Pedler, M.P., is to be let unfurnished, and an order to view this property was found in the pocket of the man who was at first thought to have committed suicide by throwing himself on the live rail at Hyde Park Corner Tube Station. In an upper room of the Mill House, the body of a beautiful young woman was discovered yesterday, strangled. She is thought to be a foreigner, but so far has not been identified. The police are reported to have a clue. Sir Eustace Pedler, the owner of the Mill House, is wintering on the Riviera." Chapter 5. In the first heat of indignation, I found my next step unexpectedly easy to tackle. I had had a half-formed plan in my head when I went into Scotland Yard. One to be carried out if my interview there was unsatisfactory. It had been profoundly unsatisfactory. That is, if I had the nerve to go through with it. Things that one would shrink from attempting normally are easily tackled in a flash of anger. Without giving myself time to reflect, I walked straight to the house of Lord Nasby. Lord Nasby was the millionaire owner of the Daily Budget. He owned other papers, several of them, but the Daily Budget was his special child. It was as the owner of the Daily Budget that he was known to every householder in the United Kingdom. Owing to the fact that an itinerary of the great man's daily proceedings had just been published, I knew exactly where to find him at this moment. It was his hour for dictating to his secretary in his own house. I did not, of course, suppose that any young woman who chose to come and ask for him would be at once admitted to the august presence. But I had attended to that side of the matter. In the card tray in the hall of the Flemings' house, I had observed the card of the Marquis of Loamsley, England's most famous sporting peer. I had removed the card, cleaned it carefully with breadcrumbs, and penciled upon it the words, "Please give Miss Bedingfeld a few moments of your time." Adventuresses must not be too scrupulous in their methods. The thing worked. A powdered footman received the card and bore it away. Presently a pale secretary appeared. I fenced with him successfully. He retired, defeated. He again reappeared and begged me to follow him. I did so. I entered a large room, A frightened-looking shorthand typist fled past me like a visitant from the spirit world. Then the door shut, and I was face to face with Lord Nasby. A big man. Big head. Big face. Big mustache. Big stomach. I pulled myself together. I had not come here to comment on Lord Nasby's stomach. He was already roaring at me.
"Well, what is it? What does Lomsley want? You his secretary? What's it all about?"
"To begin with," I said, with as great an appearance of coolness as I could manage, "I don't know Lord Lomsley, and he certainly knows nothing about me. I took his card from the tray in the house of the people I'm staying with and wrote those words on it myself. It was important that I should see you." For a moment it appeared to be a toss-up as to whether Lord Nasby had apoplexy or not. In the end, he swallowed twice and got over it.
"I admire your coolness, young woman. Well, you see me. If you interest me, you will continue to see me for exactly 2 minutes longer."
"That will be ample," I replied, "and I shall interest you. It's the Mill House mystery."
"If you found the man in the brown suit, write to the editor,"
he interrupted hastily. "If you will interrupt, I shall be more than 2 minutes," I said sternly. "I haven't found the man in the brown suit, but I'm quite likely to do so." In as few words as possible, I put the facts of the tube accident and the conclusions I had drawn from them before him. When I had finished, he said unexpectedly,
"What do you know of brachycephalic heads?"
I mentioned Papa.
"The monkey man, eh? Well, you seem to have a head of some kind upon your own shoulders, young woman. But it's all pretty thin, you know, not much to go upon, and no use to us as it stands."
"I'm perfectly aware of that."
"What do you want, then?"
"I want a job on your paper to investigate this matter."
"Can't do that. We've got our own special man on it."
"And I've got my own special knowledge."
"What you've just told me, eh?"
"Oh, no, Lord Nasby. I've still got something up my sleeve."
"Oh, you have you? You seem a bright sort of girl. Well, what is it?"
"When this so-called doctor got into the lift, he dropped a piece of paper. I picked it up. It smelt of mothballs. So did the dead man. The doctor didn't. So I saw at once that the doctor must have taken it off the body. It had 2 words written on it and some figures."
"Let's see it."
Lord Nasby stretched out a careless hand. "I think not," I said, smiling. "It's my find, you see."
"I'm right. You are a bright girl. Quite right to hang on to it. No scruples about not handing it over to the police?"
"I went there to do so this morning. They persisted in regarding the whole thing as having nothing to do with the Marlowe affair, so I thought that, in the circumstances, I was justified in retaining the paper. Besides, the inspector put my back up."
"Short-sighted man. Well, my dear girl, here's all I can do for you. Go on working on this line of yours. If you get anything that's publishable, send it along, and you shall have your chance. There's always room for real talent on the daily budget, but you've got to make good first, see?"
I thanked him and apologized for my methods.
"Don't mention it. I rather like cheek, from a pretty girl. By the way, you said 2 minutes and you've been 3, allowing for interruptions. For a woman, that's quite remarkable. Must be your scientific training."
I was in the street again, breathing hard as though I had been running. I found Lord Nasby rather wearing as a new acquaintance. Chapter 6. I went home with a feeling of exultation. My scheme had succeeded far better than I could possibly have hoped. Lord Nasby had been positively genial. It only now remained for me to make good, as he expressed it. Once locked in my own room, I took out my precious piece of paper and studied it attentively. Here was the clue to the mystery. To begin with, what did the figures represent? There were 5 of them, and a dot after the first 2. 17, 122, I murmured. That did not seem to lead to anything. Next, I added them up. That is often done in works of fiction and leads to surprising deductions. 1 and 7 make 8, and 1 is 9, and 2 are 11, and 2 are 13. 13! Fateful number! Was this a warning to me to leave the whole thing alone? Very possibly. Anyway, except as a warning, it seemed to be singularly useless. I declined to believe that any conspirator would take that way of writing 13 in real life. If he meant 13, he would write 13. 1, 3, like that. There was a space between the 1 and the 2. I accordingly subtracted 22 from 171. The result was 159. I did it again and made it 149. These arithmetical exercises were doubtless excellent practice, but as regarded the solution of the mystery, they seemed totally ineffectual. I left arithmetic alone, not attempting fancied division or multiplication, and went on to the words. Kilmorden Castle. That was something definite, a place, probably the cradle of an aristocratic family. Missing heir? Claimant to title? Or possibly a picturesque ruin? Buried treasure? Yes, on the whole I incline to the theory of buried treasure. Figures always go with buried treasure. 1 pace to the right, 7 paces to the left, dig 1 foot, descend 22 steps. That sort of idea. I could work out that later. The thing was to get to Kilmorden Castle as quickly as possible. I made a strategic sally from my room and returned laden with books of reference. Who's Who, Whitaker, a gazetteer, a history of Scotch ancestral homes, and Somebody or Others, British Isles. Time passed. I searched diligently, but with growing annoyance. Finally, I shut the last book with a bang. There appeared to be no such place as Kilmorden Castle. Here was an unexpected check. There must be such a place. Why should anyone invent a name like that and write it down on a piece of paper? Absurd. Another idea occurred to me. Possibly it was a castellated abomination in the suburbs with a high-sounding name invented by its owner. But if so, it was going to be extraordinarily hard to find. I sat back gloomily on my heels. I always sit on the floor to do anything really important, and wondered how on earth I was to set about it. Was there any other line I could follow? I reflected earnestly, and then sprang to my feet delightedly. Of course, I must visit the scene of the crime, always done by the best sleuths. And no matter how long afterwards it may be, they always find something that the police had overlooked. My course was clear. I must go to Marlow. But how was I to get into the house? I discarded several adventurous methods and plumped for stern simplicity. The house had been let, presumably was still to let. I would be a prospective tenant. I also decided on attacking the local house agents, as having fewer houses on their books. Here, however, I reckoned without my host. A pleasant clerk produced particulars of about 6 desirable properties. It took all my ingenuity to find objections to them. In the end, I feared I had drawn a blank. "And you really have nothing else?" I asked, gazing pathetically into the clerk's eyes. "Something right on the river and with a fair amount of garden and a small lodge," I added, summing up the main points of the mill house as I had gathered them from the papers.
"Well, of course, there's Sir Eustace Pedlar's place," said the man doubtfully. "The mill house, you know."
Not where?" I faltered. Really, faltering is getting to be my strong point.
"That's it, where the murder took place. But perhaps you wouldn't like—"
"Oh, I don't think I should mind," I said with the appearance of rallying. I felt my bona fides was now quite established. "And perhaps I might get it cheap in the circumstances." A master touch, that, I thought.
"Well, it's possible. There's no pretending that it will be easy to let now. Servants and all that, you know. If you like the place after you've seen it, I should advise you to make an offer. Shall I write you out an order?"
"If you please." A quarter of an hour later, I was at the lodge of the mill house. In answer to my knock, the door flew open, and a tall middle-aged woman literally bounced out. "Nobody can go into that house, do you hear that? Fairly sick of you reporters, I am. Sir Eustace's orders are—" "I understood the house was to let," I said freezingly, holding out my order. "Of course, if it's already taken—" "Oh, I'm sure I beg your pardon, miss. I've been fairly pestered with these newspaper people. Not a minute's peace. No, the house isn't let, nor likely to be now." "Are the drains wrong?" I asked in an anxious whisper. "Oh, Lord, miss, the drains is all right. But surely you've heard about that foreign lady who was done to death here?" "I believe I did read something about it in the papers," I said carelessly. My indifference piqued the good woman. If I had betrayed any interest, she would probably have closed up like an oyster. As it was, she positively bridled. "I should say you did, miss. It's been in all the newspapers. The daily budget's out still to catch the man who did it. It seems, according to them, as our police are no good at all. Well, I hope they'll get him. Although a nice-looking young fellow he was, and no mistake. A kind of soldierly look about him. Oh, well, I dare say he'd been wounded in the war. And sometimes they go a bit queer afterwards. My sister's boy did. Perhaps she'd used him bad. They're a bad lot, those foreigners. Though she was a fine-looking woman, stood there where you're standing now." "Was she dark or fair?" I ventured. "You can't tell from these newspaper portraits." "Dark hair, and a very wide face. Too wide for nature, I thought. And her lips reddened something cruel. I don't like to see it. A little powder now and then is quite another thing." We were conversing like old friends now. I put another question. "Did she seem nervous or upset at all?" "Not a bit. She was smiling to herself, quiet-like, as though she was amused at something. That's why you could have knocked me down with a feather when, the next afternoon, those people came running out calling for the police and saying there'd been murder done. I shall never get over it. And as for setting foot in that house after dark, I wouldn't do it, not if it was ever so. Why, I wouldn't even stay here at the lodge if Sir Eustace hadn't been down on his bended knees to me." "I thought Sir Eustace Pedler was at Cannes." "So he was, miss. He came back to England when he heard the news. And as to the bended knees, that was a figure of speech, his secretary, Mr. Paget, having offered us double pay to stay on, and, as my John says, money is money nowadays." I concurred heartily with John's by no means original remarks. "The young man now," said Mrs. James, reverting suddenly to a former point in the conversation. "He was upset. His eyes, light eyes they were, I noticed them particular, was all shining, excited, I thought. But I never dreamt of anything being wrong, not even when he came out again looking all queer." "How long was he in the house?" "Oh, not long. A matter of 5 minutes, maybe." "How tall was he, do you think? About 6 foot?" "I should say so, maybe." "He was clean-shaven, you say?" "Yes, miss. Not even one of these toothbrush moustaches. Was his chin all shiny? I asked on a sudden impulse. Mrs. James stared at me with awe. Well, now you come to mention it, miss, it was. However did you know? It's a curious thing, but murderers often have shiny chins, I explained wildly. Mrs. James accepted the statement in all good faith. Really now, miss, I never heard that before. You didn't notice what kind of a head he had, I suppose? Just the ordinary kind, miss. I'll fetch you the keys, shall I? I accepted them and went on my way to the mill house. My reconstructions so far I considered good. All along, I had realized that the differences between the man Mrs. James had described and my tube doctor were those of non-essentials. An overcoat, a beard, gold-rimmed eyeglasses. The doctor had appeared middle-aged, but I remembered that he had stooped over the body like a comparatively young man. There had been a suppleness which told of young joints. The victim of the accident, the mothball man, as I called him to myself, and the foreign woman, Mrs. de Castina, or whatever her real name was, had had an assignation to meet at the mill house. That was how I pieced the thing together. Either because they feared they were being watched, or for some other reason, they chose the rather ingenious method of both getting an order to view the same house. Thus their meeting there might have had the appearance of pure chance. That the mothball man had suddenly caught sight of the doctor, and that the meeting was totally unexpected and alarming to him, was another fact of which I was fairly sure. What had happened next? The doctor had removed his disguise and followed the woman to Marlow. But it was possible that, had he removed it rather hastily, traces of spirit gum might still linger on his chin. Hence my question to Mrs. James. Whilst occupied with my thoughts, I had arrived at the low old-fashioned door of the mill house. Unlocking it with the key, I passed inside. The hall was low and dark. The place smelt forlorn and mildewy. In spite of myself, I shivered. Did the woman who had come here smiling to herself a few days ago feel no chill of premonition as she entered this house? I wondered. Did the smile fade from her lips, and did a nameless dread close around her heart? Or had she gone upstairs, smiling still, unconscious of the doom that was so soon to overtake her? My heart beat a little faster. Was the house really empty? Was doom waiting for me in it also? For the first time, I understood the meaning of the much-used word, atmosphere. There was an atmosphere in this house, an atmosphere of cruelty, of menace, of evil. Chapter 7. Shaking off the feelings that oppressed me, I quickly went upstairs. I had no difficulty in finding the room of the tragedy. On the day the body was discovered, it had rained heavily, and large muddy boots had trampled the uncarpeted floor in every direction. I wondered if the murderer had left any footmarks the previous day. It was likely that the police would be reticent on the subject if he had, but on consideration I decided it was unlikely. The weather had been fine and dry. There was nothing of interest about the room. It was almost square, with 2 big bay windows, plain white walls, and a bare floor, the boards being stained round the edges where the carpet had ceased. I searched it carefully, but there was not so much as a pin lying about. The gifted young detective did not seem likely to discover a neglected clue. I had brought with me a pencil and notebook. There did not seem much to note, but I duly jotted down a brief sketch of the room to cover my disappointment at the failure of my quest. As I was in the act of returning the pencil to my bag, it slipped from my fingers and rolled along the floor. The mill house was really old, and the floors were very uneven. The pencil rolled steadily, with increasing momentum, until it came to rest under one of the windows. In the recess of each window there was a broad window seat, underneath which there was a cupboard. My pencil was lying right against the cupboard door. The cupboard was shut, but it suddenly occurred to me that if it had been open, my pencil would have rolled inside. I opened the door, and my pencil immediately rolled in and sheltered modestly at the farthest corner. I retrieved it, noting as I did so that, owing to the lack of light and the peculiar formation of the cupboard, one could not see it, but had to feel for it. Apart from my pencil, the cupboard was empty, but being thorough by nature, I tried the one under the opposite window. At first sight, it looked as though that also was empty, but I grubbed about perseveringly, and was rewarded by feeling my hand close on a hard paper cylinder which lay in a sort of trough or depression in the far corner of the cupboard. As soon as I had it in my hand, I knew what it was. A roll of Kodak films. Here was a find. I realized, of course, that these films might very well be an old roll belonging to Sir Eustace Pedlar, which rolled in here and had not been found when the cupboard was emptied. But I did not think so. The red paper was far too fresh-looking. It was just as dusty as it would have been had it lain there for 2 or 3 days. That is to say, since the murder. Had it been there for any length of time, it would have been thickly coated. Who had dropped it? The woman or the man? I remembered that the contents of her handbag had appeared to be intact. If it had been jerked open in the struggle and the roll of films had fallen out, surely some of the loose money would have been scattered about also. No, it was not the woman who had dropped the films. I sniffed suddenly and suspiciously. Was the smell of mothballs becoming an obsession with me? I could swear that the roll of film smelt of it also. I held them under my nose. They had, as usual, a strong smell of their own, but apart from that, I could clearly detect the odour I disliked so much. I soon found the cause. A minute shred of cloth had caught on a rough edge of the centre wood, and that shred was strongly impregnated with mothballs. At some time or another, the films had been carried in the overcoat pocket of the man who was killed in the tube. Was it he who had dropped them here? Hardly. His movements were all accounted for. No. It was the other man, the doctor. He had taken the films when he had taken the paper. It was he who had dropped them here during his struggle with the woman. I had got my clue. I would have the roll developed, and then I would have further developments to work upon. Very elated, I left the house, returned the keys to Mrs. James, and made my way as quickly as possible to the station. On the way back to town, I took out my paper and studied it afresh. Suddenly, the figures took on a new significance. Suppose they were a date. 17/1/22. The 17th of January, 1922. Surely that must be it. Idiot that I was, not to have thought of it before. But in that case, I must find out the whereabouts of Kilmorden Castle, for today was actually the 14th. 3 days. Little enough, almost hopeless when one had no idea of where to look. It was too late to hand in my roll today. I had to hurry home to Kensington so as not to be late for dinner. It occurred to me that there was an easy way of verifying whether some of my conclusions were correct. I asked Mr. Fleming whether there had been a camera amongst the dead man's belongings. I knew that he had taken an interest in the case and was conversant with all the details. To my surprise and annoyance, he replied that there had been no camera. All Carton's effects had been gone over very carefully in the hopes of finding something that might throw light upon his state of mind. He was positive that there had been no photographic apparatus of any kind. That was rather a setback to my theory. If he had no camera, why should he be carrying a roll of films? I set out early the next morning to take my precious roll to be developed. I was so fussy that I went all the way to Regent Street to the big Kodak place. I handed it in and asked for a print of each film. The man finished stacking together a heap of films packed in yellow tin cylinders for the tropics and picked up my roll. He looked at me.
"You've made a mistake, I think,"
he said, smiling. "Oh, no," I said. "I'm sure I haven't."
"You've given me the wrong roll. This is an unexposed one."
I walked out with what dignity I could muster. I dare say it is good for one now and again to realize what an idiot one can be, but nobody relishes the process. And then, just as I was passing one of the big shipping offices, I came to a sudden halt. In the window was a beautiful model of one of the company's boats, and it was labelled Kenilworth Castle. A wild idea shot through my brain. I pushed the door open and went in. I went up to the counter, and in faltering voice, genuine this time, I murmured, "Kilmorden Castle?"
"On the 17th from Southampton, Cape Town. First or second class?"
"How much is it?"
"First class, £87.
I interrupted him. The coincidence was too much for me. Exactly the amount of my legacy. I would put all my eggs in one basket. "First class," I said. I was now definitely committed to the adventure.
Chapter 8. Extracts from the Diary of Sir Eustace Pedlar, MP. It is an extraordinary thing that I never seem to get any peace. I am a man who likes a quiet life. I like my club, my rubber of bridge, a well-cooked meal, a sound wine. I like England in the summer, and the Riviera in the winter. I have no desire to participate in sensational happenings. Sometimes, in front of a good fire, I do not object to reading about them in the newspaper, but that is as far as I am willing to go. My object in life is to be thoroughly comfortable. I have devoted a certain amount of thought and a considerable amount of money to further that end, but I cannot say that I always succeed. If things do not actually happen to me, they happen round me, and frequently, in spite of myself, I become involved. I hate being involved. All this because Guy Paget came into my bedroom this morning with a telegram in his hand and a face as long as a mute at a funeral. Guy Paget is my secretary, a zealous, painstaking, hard-working fellow, admirable in every respect. I know no one who annoys me more. For a long time I have been racking my brains as to how to get rid of him. But you cannot very well dismiss a secretary because he prefers work to play, likes getting up early in the morning, and has positively no vices. The only amusing thing about the fellow is his face. He has the face of a 14th-century poisoner, the sort of man the Borgias got to do their odd jobs for them. I wouldn't mind so much if Paget didn't make me work too. My idea of work is something that should be undertaken lightly and airily, trifled with, in fact. I doubt if Guy Paget has ever trifled with anything in his life. He takes everything seriously. That is what makes him so difficult to live with. Last week I had the brilliant idea of sending him off to Florence. He talked about Florence and how much he wanted to go there. "My dear fellow," I cried, "you should go tomorrow. I will pay all your expenses." January isn't the usual time for going to Florence, but it would be all one to Paget. I could imagine him going about, guidebook in hand, religiously doing the picture galleries, and a week's freedom was cheap to me at the price. It has been a delightful week. I have done everything I wanted to, and nothing that I did not want to do. But when I blinked my eyes open and perceived Paget standing there between me and the light at the unearthly hour of 9 a.m. this morning, I realized that freedom was over. "My dear fellow," I said, "has the funeral already taken place, or is it for later in the morning?" Paget does not appreciate dry humour. He merely stared. "So you know, Sir Eustace?" "Know what?" I said crossly. "From the expression of your face I inferred that one of your near and dear relatives was to be interred this morning." Paget ignored the sally as far as possible. "I thought you couldn't know about this." He tapped the telegram. "I know you dislike being aroused early, but it is 9 o'clock. Paget insists on regarding 9 a.m. as practically the middle of the day. And I thought that, under the circumstances—" He tapped the telegram again. "What is that thing?" I asked. "It's a telegram from the police at Marlow. A woman has been murdered in your house." That aroused me in earnest. "What colossal cheek!" I exclaimed. "Why in my house? Who murdered her?" "They don't say. I suppose we shall go back to England at once, Sir Eustace?" "You need suppose nothing of the kind. Why should we go back?" "The police." "What on earth have I to do with the police?" "Well, it was your house." "That," I said, "appears to me more my misfortune than my fault." Guy Paget shook his head gloomily. "It will have a very unfortunate effect upon the constituency," he remarked lugubriously. "I don't see why it should have. And yet I have a feeling that in such matters Paget's instincts are always right. On the face of it, a member of Parliament will be none the less efficient because a stray young woman comes and gets herself murdered in an empty house that belongs to him. But there is no accounting for the view the respectable British public takes of the matter. She's a foreigner, too, and that makes it worse," continued Paget gloomily. "Again, I believe he is right. If it is disreputable to have a woman murdered in your house, it becomes more disreputable if the woman is a foreigner." Another idea struck me. "Good heavens," I exclaimed, "I hope this won't upset Caroline." "Caroline is the lady who cooks for me. Incidentally, she is the wife of my gardener. What kind of a wife she makes, I do not know, but she is an excellent cook. James, on the other hand, is not a good gardener, but I support him in idleness and give him the lodge to live in solely on account of Caroline's cooking." "I don't suppose she'll stay after this," said Paget. "You always were a cheerful fellow," I said. "I expect I shall have to go back to England. Paget clearly intends that I shall, and there is Caroline to pacify." 3 days later. It is incredible to me that anyone who can get away from England in winter does not do so. It is an abominable climate. All this trouble is very annoying. The house agents say it will be next to impossible to let the mill house after all the publicity. Caroline has been pacified, with double pay. We could have sent her a cable to that effect from Cannes. In fact, as I have said all along, there was no earthly purpose to serve by our coming over. I shall go back tomorrow. 1 day later. Several very surprising things have occurred. To begin with, I met with Augustus Milray, the most perfect example of an old ass the present government has produced. His manner oozed diplomatic secrecy as he drew me aside in the club into a quiet corner. He talked a good deal about South Africa and the industrial situation there, about the growing rumours of a strike on the Rand, of the secret causes actuating that strike. I listened as patiently as I could. Finally he dropped his voice to a whisper and explained that certain documents had come to light which ought to be placed in the hands of General Smuts. "I've no doubt you're quite right," I said, stifling a yawn. "But how are we to get them to him? Our position in the matter is delicate, very delicate." "What's wrong with the post?" I said cheerfully. Put a twopenny stamp on and drop 'em in the nearest letterbox." He seemed quite shocked at the suggestion. "My dear pedlar, the common post?" It has always been a mystery to me why governments employ king's messengers and draw such attention to their confidential documents. If you don't like the post, send one of your young Foreign Office fellows. He'll enjoy the trip." "Impossible," said Milray, wagging his head in a senile fashion. "There are reasons, my dear pedlar. I assure you, there are reasons." "Well," I said, rising, "all this is very interesting, but I must be off." "1 minute, my dear pedlar, 1 minute, I beg of you. Now tell me in confidence, is it not true that you intend visiting South Africa shortly yourself? You have large interests in Rhodesia, I know, and the question of Rhodesia joining in the Union is one in which you have a vital interest." "Well, I had thought of going out in about a month's time." "You couldn't possibly make it sooner? This month? This week, in fact?" "I could," I said, eyeing him with some interest, "but I don't know that I particularly want to." "You would be doing the government a great service, a very great service. You would not find them ungrateful." "Meaning you want me to be the postman?" "Exactly. Your position is an unofficial one. Your journey is bona fide. Everything would be eminently satisfactory." "Well," I said slowly, "I don't mind if I do. The one thing I am anxious to do is to get out of England again as soon as possible." "You will find the climate of South Africa delightful, quite delightful." "My dear fellow, I know all about the climate. I was out there shortly before the war." "I am really much obliged to you, pedlar. I will send you round the package by messenger, to be placed in General Smuts' own hands, you understand. The Kilmorden Castle sails on Saturday. Quite a good boat." I accompanied him a short way along Pall Mall before we parted. He shook me warmly by the hand and thanked me very effusively. I walked home reflecting on the curious byways of governmental policy. It was the following evening that Jarvis, my butler, informed me that a gentleman wished to see me on private business, but declined to give his name. I have always a lively apprehension of insurance touts, so told Jarvis to say I could not see him. Guy Paget, unfortunately, when he might for once have been of real use, was laid up with a bilious attack. These earnest, hard-working young men with weak stomachs are always liable to bilious attacks. Jarvis returned. "The gentleman asked me to tell you, Sir Eustace, that he comes to you from Mr. Milray." That altered the complexion of things. A few minutes later, I was confronting my visitor in the library. He was a well-built young fellow with a deeply tanned face. A scar ran diagonally from the corner of his eye to the jaw, disfiguring what otherwise would have been a handsome, though somewhat reckless, countenance. "Well," I said, "what's the matter?" "Mr. Milray sent me to you, Sir Eustace. I am to accompany you to South Africa as your secretary." "My dear fellow," I said, "I've got a secretary already. I don't want another." "I think you do, Sir Eustace. Where is your secretary now?" "He's down with a bilious attack," I explained. "You are sure it's only a bilious attack?" "Of course it is. He's subject to them." My visitor smiled. "It may or may not be a bilious attack. Time will show, but I can tell you this, Sir Eustace. Mr. Milray would not be surprised if an attempt were made to get your secretary out of the way. Oh, you need have no fear for yourself." I suppose a momentary alarm had flickered across my face. "You are not threatened. Your secretary out of the way, access to you would be easier. In any case, Mr. Milray wishes me to accompany you. The passage money will be our affair, of course, but you will take the necessary steps about the passport, as though you had decided that you needed the services of a second secretary." He seemed a determined young man. We stared at each other, and he stared me down. "Very well," I said feebly. "You will say nothing to anyone as to my accompanying you?" "Very well," I said again. After all, perhaps it was better to have this fellow with me. But I had a premonition that I was getting into deep waters, just when I thought I had attained peace. I stopped my visitor as he was turning to depart. "It might be just as well if I knew my new secretary's name," I observed sarcastically. He considered for a minute. "Harry Rayburn seems quite a suitable name," he observed. It was a curious way of putting it. "Very well," I said for the third time.
Chapter 9. It is most undignified for a heroine to be seasick. In books, the more it rolls and tosses, the better she likes it. When everybody else is ill, she alone staggers along the deck, braving the elements and positively rejoicing in the storm. I regret to say that at the first roll the Kilmorden gave, I turned pale and hastened below. A sympathetic stewardess received me. She suggested dry toast and ginger ale. I remained groaning in my cabin for 3 days. Forgotten was my quest. I had no longer any interest in solving mysteries. I was a totally different Anne to the one who had rushed back to the South Kensington Square so jubilantly from the shipping office. I smile now as I remember my abrupt entry into the drawing-room. Mrs. Fleming was alone there. She turned her head as I entered. "Is that you, Anne, my dear? There is something I want to talk over with you." "Yes," I said, curbing my impatience. "Miss Emery is leaving me." Miss Emery was the governess. "As you have not yet succeeded in finding anything, I wondered if you would care. It would be so nice if you remained with us altogether." I was touched. She didn't want me, I knew. It was sheer Christian charity that prompted the offer. I felt remorseful for my secret criticism of her. Getting up, I ran impulsively across the room and flung my arms around her neck. "You're a dear," I said. "A dear, a dear, a dear. And thank you ever so much. But it's all right. I'm off to South Africa on Sunday." My abrupt onslaught had startled the good lady. She was not used to sudden demonstrations of affection. My words startled her still more. "To South Africa? My dear Anne, we would have to look into anything of that kind very carefully." That was the last thing I wanted. I explained that I had already taken my passage, and that upon arrival I proposed to take up the duties of a parlour-maid. It was the only thing I could think of on the spur of the moment. There was, I said, a great demand for parlour-maids in South Africa. I assured her that I was equal to taking care of myself, and in the end, with a sigh of relief at getting me off her hands, she accepted the project without further query. At parting, she slipped an envelope into my hand. Inside it, I found 5 new crisp £5 notes, and the words, "I hope you will not be offended, and will accept this with my love." She was a very good, kind woman. I could not have continued to live in the same house with her, but I did recognize her intrinsic worth. So, here I was, with £25 in my pocket, facing the world and pursuing my adventure. It was on the 4th day that the stewardess finally urged me up on deck. Under the impression that I should die quicker below, I had steadfastly refused to leave my bunk. She now tempted me with the advent of Madeira. Hope rose in my breast. I could leave the boat and go ashore and be a parlour-maid there. Anything for dry land. Muffled in coats and rugs, and weak as a kitten on my legs, I was hauled up and deposited, an inert mass, on a deck chair. I lay there with my eyes closed, hating life. The purser, a fair-haired young man with a round, boyish face, came and sat down beside me.
"Hullo? Feeling rather sorry for yourself, eh?"
"Yes," I replied, hating him.
"Ah, you will know yourself in another day or two. We've had rather a nasty dusting in the bay, but there's smooth weather ahead. I'll be taking you on at quartz tomorrow."
I did not reply.
"Think you'll never recover, eh? But I've seen people much worse than you, and 2 days later they were the life and soul of the ship. You'll be the same."
I did not feel sufficiently pugnacious to tell him outright that he was a liar. I endeavoured to convey it by a glance. He chatted pleasantly for a few minutes more, then he mercifully departed. People passed and repassed, brisk couples exercising, curvetting children, laughing young people. A few other pallid sufferers lay, like myself, in deck chairs. The air was pleasant, crisp, not too cold, and the sun was shining brightly. Insensibly, I felt a little cheered. I began to watch the people. One woman in particular attracted me. She was about 30, of medium height and very fair, with a round dimpled face and very blue eyes. Her clothes, though perfectly plain, had that indefinable air of cut about them which spoke of Paris. Also, in a pleasant but self-possessed way, she seemed to own the ship. Deck stewards ran to and fro, obeying her commands. She had a special deck chair and an apparently inexhaustible supply of cushions. She changed her mind 3 times as to where she would like it placed. Throughout everything she remained attractive and charming. She appeared to be one of those rare people in the world who knew what they want, see that they get it, and manage to do so without being offensive. I decided that if I ever recovered, but of course I shouldn't, it would amuse me to talk to her. We reached Madeira about midday. I was still too inert to move, but I enjoyed the picturesque-looking merchants who came on board and spread their merchandise about the decks. There were flowers, too. I buried my nose in an enormous bunch of sweet, wet violets and felt distinctly better. In fact, I thought I might just possibly last out the end of the voyage. When my stewardess spoke of the attractions of a little chicken broth, I only protested feebly. When it came, I enjoyed it. My attractive woman had been ashore. She came back escorted by a tall, soldierly-looking man with dark hair and a bronzed face, whom I had noticed striding up and down the deck earlier in the day. I put him down at once as one of the strong, silent men of Rhodesia. He was about 40, with a touch of greying hair at either temple, and was easily the best-looking man on board. When the stewardess brought me up an extra rug, I asked her if she knew who my attractive woman was. "That's a well-known society lady, the Honourable Mrs. Clarence Blair. You must have read about her in the papers." I nodded, looking at her with renewed interest. Mrs. Blair was very well known indeed as one of the smartest women of the day. I observed with some amusement that she was the centre of a good deal of attention. Several people essayed to scrape acquaintance with the pleasant informality that a boat allows. I admired the polite way that Mrs. Blair snubbed them. She appeared to have adopted the strong, silent man as her special cavalier, and he seemed duly sensible of the privilege accorded him. The following morning, to my surprise, after taking a few turns round the deck with her attentive companion, Mrs. Blair came to a halt by my chair. "Feeling better this morning?" I thanked her, and said I felt slightly more like a human being. "You did look ill yesterday. Colonel Race and I decided that we should have the excitement of a funeral at sea, but you've disappointed us." I laughed. "Being up in the air has done me good."
"Nothing like fresh air,"
said Colonel Race, smiling. Being shut up in those stuffy cabins would kill anyone, declared Mrs. Blair, dropping into a seat by my side and dismissing her companion with a little nod. You've got an outside one, I hope? I shook my head. My dear girl, why don't you change? There's plenty of room. A lot of people got off at Madeira, and the boat's very empty. Talk to the purser about it. He's a nice little boy. He changed me into a beautiful cabin because I didn't care for the one I'd got. You talk to him at lunchtime when you go down. I shuddered. I couldn't move. Don't be silly. Come and take a walk now with me. She dimpled at me encouragingly. I felt very weak on my legs at first, but as we walked briskly up and down, I began to feel a brighter and better being. After a turn or two, Colonel Race joined us again.
You can see the grand peak of Tenerife from the other side.
Can we? Can I get a photograph of it, do you think?
No, but that won't deter you from snapping off at it.
Mrs. Blair laughed. You are unkind. Some of my photographs are very good.
About 3% effective, I should say.
We all went round to the other side of the deck. There, glimmering white and snowy, enveloped in a delicate rose-coloured mist, rose the glistening pinnacle. I uttered an exclamation of delight. Mrs. Blair ran for her camera. Undeterred by Colonel Race's sardonic comments, she snapped vigorously. There, that's the end of the roll. Oh, her tone changed to one of chagrin. I've had the thing at bulb all the time.
I always like to see a child with a new toy, murmured the Colonel.
How horrid you are! But I've got another roll. She produced it in triumph from the pocket of her sweater. A sudden roll of the boat upset her balance, and as she caught at the rail to steady herself, the roll of films flashed over the side. "Oh!" cried Mrs. Blair, comically dismayed. She leaned over. "Do you think they have gone overboard?"
No, you may have been fortunate enough to brain an unlucky steward in the deck below.
A small boy who had arrived unobserved a few paces to our rear blew a deafening blast on a bugle. "Lunch!" declared Mrs. Blair ecstatically. "I've had nothing to eat since breakfast, except 2 cups of beef tea."
"Lunch, Miss Bedingfeld?"
"Well," I said waveringly, "yes, I do feel rather hungry." "Splendid. You're sitting at the purser's table, I know. Tackle him about the cabin." I found my way down to the saloon, began to eat gingerly, and finished by consuming an enormous meal. My friend of yesterday congratulated me on my recovery. Everyone was changing cabins today, he told me, and he promised that my things should be moved to an outside one without delay. There were only 4 at our table, myself, a couple of elderly ladies, and a missionary who talked a lot about our poor black brothers. I looked round at the other tables. Mrs. Blair was sitting at the captain's table, Colonel Race next to her. On the other side of the captain was a distinguished-looking grey-haired man. A good many people I had already noticed on deck, but there was one man who had not previously appeared. Had he done so, he could hardly have escaped my notice. He was tall and dark, and had such a peculiarly sinister type of countenance that I was quite startled. I asked the purser, with some curiosity, who he was.
"That man? Oh, that's Sir Eustace Pedler's secretary. Been very seasick, poor chap, and not appeared before. Sir Eustace has got 2 secretaries with them, and the sea's been too much for both of them. The other fellow hasn't turned up yet. This man's name is Paget."
So, Sir Eustace Pedler, the owner of the mill house, was on board. Probably only a coincidence. And yet,
"That's Sir Eustace," my informant continued, "sitting next to the captain. Pompous old ass."
The more I studied the secretary's face, the less I liked it. Its even pallor, the secretive, heavy-lidded eyes, the curiously flattened head, it all gave me a feeling of distaste, of apprehension. Leaving the saloon at the same time as he did, I was close behind him as he went up on deck. He was speaking to Sir Eustace, and I overheard a fragment or two.
"I'll see about the cabin at once, then, shall I? It's impossible to work in yours with all your trunks." "My dear fellow," Sir Eustace replied, "my cabin is intended, A, for me to sleep in, and B, to attempt to dress in. I never had any intentions of allowing you to sprawl about the place, making an infernal clicking with that typewriter of yours." "That's just what I say, Sir Eustace. We must have somewhere to work."
Here I parted company from them and went below to see if my removal was in progress. I found my steward busy at the task. "Very nice cabin, miss, on D deck, number 13. "Oh, no," I cried, "not 13. 13 is the one thing I am superstitious about." It was a nice cabin, too. I inspected it, wavered, but a foolish superstition prevailed. I appealed almost tearfully to the steward. "Isn't there any other cabin I can have?" The steward reflected.
"Well, there's 17 just along the starboard side. That was empty this morning, but I rather fancy it's been allotted to someone. Still, as the gentlemen's things aren't in yet, and as gentlemen aren't anything like so superstitious as ladies, I dare say he wouldn't mind changing."
I hailed the proposition gratefully, and the steward departed to obtain permission from the purser. He returned grinning.
"That's all right, miss. We can go along."
He led the way to 17. It was not quite as large as number 13, but I found it eminently satisfactory.
"I'll fetch your things right away, miss," said the steward.
But at that moment, the man with the sinister face, as I had nicknamed him, appeared in the doorway.
"Excuse me," he said, "but this cabin is reserved for the use of Sir Eustace Pedler." "That's all right, sir," explained the steward. "We're fitting up number 13 instead." "No, it was number 17 I was to have." "No, 13 is a better cabin, sir, larger." "I specially selected number 17, and the purser said I could have it."
"I'm sorry," I said coldly, "but number 17 has been allotted to me."
"I can't agree to that." The steward put in his oar. "The other cabin's just the same, only better." "I want number 17. "What's all this?" demanded a new voice. "Steward, put my things in here. This is my cabin."
It was my neighbour at lunch, the Reverend Edward Chichester. "I beg your pardon," I said. "It's my cabin."
"It's allotted to Sir Eustace Pedler," said Mr. Paget. We were all getting rather heated. "I'm sorry to have to dispute the matter," said Chichester with a meek smile which failed to mask his determination to get his own way. Meek men are always obstinate, I have noticed. He edged himself sideways into the doorway. "You're to have number 28 on the port side," said the steward. "A very good cabin, sir." "I am afraid that I must insist. Number 17 was the cabin promised to me." We had come to an impasse. Each one of us was determined not to give way. Strictly speaking, I, at any rate, might have retired from the contest and eased matters by offering to accept cabin 28. So long as I did not have 13, it was immaterial to me what other cabin I had. But my blood was up. I had not the least intention of being the first to give way, and I disliked Chichester. He had false teeth which clicked when he ate. Many men have been hated for less.
We all said the same things over again. The steward assured us, even more strongly, that both the other cabins were better cabins. None of us paid any attention to him. Paget began to lose his temper. Chichester kept his serenely. With an effort, I also kept mine. And still none of us would give way an inch. A wink and a whispered word from the steward gave me my cue. I faded unobtrusively from the scene. I was lucky enough to encounter the purser almost immediately. "Oh, please," I said. "You did say I could have cabin 17, and the others won't go away. Mr. Chichester and Mr. Paget. You will let me have it, won't you? I always say that there are no people like sailors for being nice to women." My little purser came to the scratch splendidly. He strode to the scene, informed the disputants that number 17 was my cabin. They could have numbers 13 and 28 respectively, or stay where they were, whichever they chose. I permitted my eyes to tell him what a hero he was, and then installed myself in my new domain. The encounter had done me worlds of good. The sea was smooth, the weather growing daily warmer. Seasickness was a thing of the past. I went up on deck and was initiated into the mysteries of deck quoits. I entered my name for various sports. Tea was served on deck, and I ate heartily. After tea, I played shovelboard with some pleasant young men. They were extraordinarily nice to me. I felt that life was satisfactory and delightful. The dressing bugle came as a surprise, and I hurried to my new cabin. The stewardess was awaiting me with a troubled face. "There's a terrible smell in your cabin, miss. What it is, I'm sure I can't think, but I doubt if you'll be able to sleep here. There's a deck cabin up on C deck, I believe. You might move into that, just for the night anyway." The smell really was pretty bad, quite nauseating. I told the stewardess I would think over the question of moving whilst I dressed. I hurried over my toilet, sniffing distastefully as I did so. What was that smell? Dead rat? No, worse than that, and quite different. Yet I knew it. It was something I had smelt before. Something... Ah, I had got it! Asphytita. I had worked in a hospital dispensary during the war for a short time, and had become acquainted with various nauseous drugs. Asphytita, that was it. But how? I sank down on the sofa, suddenly realizing the thing. Somebody had put a pinch of asphytita in my cabin. Why? So that I should vacate it? Why were they so anxious to get me out? I thought of the scene this afternoon from a rather different point of view. What was there about cabin 17 that made so many people anxious to get hold of it? The other two cabins were better cabins. Why had both men insisted on sticking to 17? 17. How the number persisted. It was on the 17th I had sailed from Southampton. It was a 17... I stopped with a sudden gasp. Quickly I unlocked my suitcase and took my precious paper from its place of concealment in some rolled stockings. 17/1/22. I had taken that for a date, the date of departure of the Kilmorden Castle. Supposing I was wrong. When I came to think of it, would anyone writing down a date think it necessary to put the year as well as the month? Supposing 17 meant cabin 17, and 1? The time, 1 o'clock. Then 22 must be the date. I looked up at my little almanac. Tomorrow was the 22nd. Chapter 10. I was violently excited. I was sure that I had hit on the right trail at last. One thing was clear. I must not move out of the cabin. The asphytida had got to be born. I examined my facts again. Tomorrow was the 22nd, and at 1 a.m. or 1 p.m., something would happen. I plumped for 1 a.m. It was now 7 o'clock. In 6 hours, I should know. I don't know how I got through the evening. I retired to my cabin fairly early. I had told the stewardess that I had a cold in the head and I didn't mind smells. She still seemed distressed, but I was firm. The evening seemed interminable. I duly retired to bed, but in view of emergencies, I swathed myself in a thick flannel dressing gown and encased my feet in slippers. Thus attired, I felt that I could spring up and take an active part in anything that happened. What did I expect to happen? I hardly knew. Vague fancies, most of them wildly improbable, flitted through my brain. But one thing I was firmly convinced of. At 1 o'clock, something would happen. At various times, I heard my fellow passengers coming to bed. Fragments of conversation, laughing good nights, floated in through the open transom. Then, silence. Most of the lights went out. There was still one in the passage outside, and there was, therefore, a certain amount of light in my cabin. I heard 8 bells go. The hour that followed seemed the longest I had ever known. I consulted my watch surreptitiously to be sure I had not overshot the time. If my deductions were wrong, if nothing happened at 1 o'clock, I should have made a fool of myself and spent all the money I had in the world on a mare's nest. My heart beat painfully. 2 bells went overhead. 1 o'clock, and nothing. Wait, what was that? I heard the quick, light patter of feet running along the passage. Then, with the suddenness of a bombshell, my cabin door burst open and a man almost fell inside. "Save me," he said hoarsely. "They're after me." It was not a moment for argument or explanation. I could hear footsteps outside. I had about 40 seconds in which to act. I had sprung to my feet and was standing facing the stranger in the middle of the cabin. A cabin does not abound in hiding places for a 6-foot man. With one arm, I pulled out my cabin trunk. He slipped down behind it under the bunk. I raised the lid. At the same time, with the other hand, I pulled down the wash basin. A deft movement, and my hair was screwed into a tiny knot on the top of my head. From the point of view of appearance, it was inartistic. From another standpoint, it was supremely artistic. A lady, with her hair screwed into an unbecoming knob, and in the act of removing a piece of soap from her trunk, with which, apparently to wash her neck, could hardly be suspected of harbouring a fugitive. There was a knock at the door, and without waiting for me to say, "Come in," it was pushed open. I don't know what I expected to see. I think I had vague ideas of Mr. Paget brandishing a revolver, or my missionary friend with a sandbag or some other lethal weapon. But certainly I did not expect to see a night stewardess, with an inquiring face and looking the essence of respectability. "I beg your pardon, miss. I thought you called out." "No," I said, "I didn't." "I'm sorry for interrupting you." "That's all right," I said. "I couldn't sleep. I thought a wash would do me good." It sounded rather as though it were a thing I never had as a general rule. "I'm sorry, miss," said the stewardess again, "but there's a gentleman about who's rather drunk, and we are afraid he might get into one of the ladies' cabins and frighten them." "How dreadful," I said, looking alarmed. "He won't come in here, will he?" "Oh, I don't think so, miss. Ring the bell if he does. Good night." "Good night." I opened the door and peeped down the corridor. Except for the retreating form of the stewardess, there was nobody in sight. Drunk! So that was the explanation of it. My histrionic talents had been wasted. I pulled the cabin trunk out a little farther and said, Come out at once, please," in an acid voice. There was no answer. I peered under the bunk. My visitor lay immovable. He seemed to be asleep. I tugged at his shoulder. He did not move. Dead drunk, I thought vexedly. What am I to do? Then I saw something that made me catch my breath. A small scarlet spot on the floor. Using all my strength, I succeeded in dragging the man out into the middle of the cabin. The dead whiteness of his face showed that he had fainted. I found the cause of his fainting easily enough. He had been stabbed under the left shoulder blade, a nasty, deep wound. I got his coat off and set to work to attend to it. At the sting of the cold water, he stirred, then sat up. "Keep still, please," I said. He was the kind of young man who recovers his faculties very quickly. He pulled himself to his feet and stood there swaying a little.
"Thank you. I don't need anything done for me."
His manner was defiant, almost aggressive. Not a word of thanks, or even common gratitude. "That is a nasty wound. You must let me dress it."
"You will do nothing of the kind."
He flung the words in my face as though I had been begging a favour of him. My temper, never placid, rose. "I cannot congratulate you upon your manners," I said coldly.
"I can at least relieve you of my presence."
He started for the door, but reeled as he did so. With an abrupt movement, I pushed him down upon the sofa. "Don't be a fool," I said unceremoniously. "You don't want to go bleeding all over the ship, do you?" He seemed to see the sense of that, for he sat quietly whilst I bandaged up the wound as best I could. "There," I said, bestowing a pat on my handiwork. "That will have to do for the present. Are you better-tempered now, and do you feel inclined to tell me what it's all about?"
"I'm sorry that I cannot satisfy your very natural curiosity."
"Why not?" I said, chagrined. He smiled nastily.
"If you want a thing broadcasted, tell a woman. Otherwise, keep your mouth shut."
"Don't you think I could keep a secret?"
"I don't think I know."
He rose to his feet. "At any rate," I said spitefully, "I shall be able to do a little broadcasting about the events of this evening."
"I've no doubt you will, too," he said indifferently.
"How dare you!" I cried angrily. We were facing each other, glaring at each other with the ferocity of bitter enemies. For the first time, I took in the details of his appearance, the close-cropped dark head, the lean jaw, the scar on the brown cheek, the curious light grey eyes that looked into mine with a sort of reckless mockery hard to describe. There was something dangerous about him. "You haven't thanked me yet for saving your life," I said with false sweetness. I hit him there. I saw him flinch distinctly. Intuitively, I knew that he hated above all to be reminded that he owed his life to me. I didn't care. I wanted to hurt him. I had never wanted to hurt anyone so much.
"I wish to God you hadn't," he said explosively. "I'd be better dead and out of it."
"I'm glad you acknowledge the debt. You can't get out of it. I saved your life, and I'm waiting for you to say thank you." If looks could have killed, I think he would have liked to kill me then. He pushed roughly past me. At the door he turned back and spoke over his shoulder.
"I shall not thank you, now or at any other time. But I acknowledge the debt. Some day I will pay it."
He was gone, leaving me with clenched hands and my heart beating like a mill race.